It began, as most southern tragedies do, under a golden sun that hid the rot beneath the surface. Savannah, Georgia, autumn of 1837. The marshes shimmered in the light, the air sweet with magnolia, and society still clung to its illusions of gentility. Beneath that charm, though, fear was beginning to whisper through the cobblestone streets. People were vanishing. Quietly, inexplicably, and without a trace. At first, no one connected the disappearances. A traveling salesman who never reached Charleston. A young woman who had come seeking work as a companion. A local surveyor whose horse was found tethered by the roadside, riderless. The town murmured about robbers, about runaways, even the fever that sometimes swept the lowlands. But as the names multiplied, the stories began to converge. Every last person had passed, at least once, through the gates of the Harwood estate. 15 miles south of Savannah, where the land gives way to endless marsh and silence, stood the grand Harwood mansion. Columns like ivory tusks, an avenue of live oaks, the scent of salt and decay carried on the wind. To outsiders, it was a marvel, a symbol of old Southern wealth. But to those who worked the grounds, it was a world apart. The estate belonged to Eleanor Harwood, a woman who seemed to defy her time. Educated, independent, unwed. Her father, Judge Thaddeus Harwood, had left her not only his fortune but also his reputation, one of respect, intellect, and discipline. Eleanor carried all of that, and something else. Something harder to name. She was known for her gatherings, elegant dinners where Savannah's finest came to drink imported wine and listen to her play the pianoforte. Her laughter filled the halls, her wit charmed even the most severe of men. And yet, there were rumors. Servants whispering of closed doors, of screams mistaken for the cry of wind across the marsh. Few dared repeat such things in town. After all, who would accuse a Harwood of impropriety? By December of that year, 7 people were missing in Chatham County. 7 souls, lost to the silence. The sheriff's reports were thin, almost careless. A few notes here, a few witness statements there. Life in the South, they said, was unpredictable. People wandered, fled debts, chased dreams elsewhere. Cases were closed. Files shelved. And so the legend began to rot quietly, like something buried too shallow to forget. It wasn't until more than a century later, in 1963, that the first real clue surfaced, a journal, found by chance during a renovation of an old outbuilding once belonging to the Harwood groundskeeper. Its leather was cracked, its ink faded, but the words, they breathed. That journal would tell of a woman who ruled not just a plantation, but an empire of fear. Of rooms that never saw daylight. Of guests who arrived for supper, and were never seen again. But before those revelations, in 1837, all anyone knew was that something, or someone, had turned Savannah's genteel calm into quiet terror. Travelers began avoiding the coastal road at night. Locals crossed themselves when the wind shifted from the marsh. And in the parlors of the wealthy, the Harwood name was still spoken with admiration, though perhaps, in private, with unease. Because no one could quite say what went on behind those shuttered windows, or why the mistress of the marsh so rarely entertained any more. Only that, when she did, someone always seemed to disappear. To understand the horrors that unfolded within the Harwood estate, one must first understand her, the woman who ruled it. Eleanor Harwood was 32 when the disappearances began. Unmarried, refined, and fiercely intelligent, she was a figure both admired and quietly feared by Savannah society. In an age when a woman's worth was measured by her husband's standing, Eleanor defied convention, managing her late father's vast plantation with precision that bordered on obsession. To her peers, she was the very image of Southern grace, a slender woman with porcelain skin and an expression always perfectly composed. Her eyes, however, betrayed something colder. Those who met her gaze described it as steady, perhaps too steady, as if she saw not the person before her, but what they could become under her control. The Harwood estate itself reflected her nature, beautiful, vast, and isolated. It sat upon a rise surrounded by thick marshland, where fog clung to the grass like memory. The main house stretched wide, its east wing sealed most of the time. Servants said it had fallen into disuse after Judge Harwood's death, though no one could explain why the mistress often had that wing cleaned and locked afterward. Records from the plantation show that Eleanor was as efficient as she was ruthless. Under her management, profits increased. The enslaved workers, more than 100 souls, endured her strict discipline. Overseers wrote of her personal involvement in punishments, unusual for a woman of her class. She called it ensuring order. Yet, beneath the cold logic of her leadership, something else was at work, a fascination with obedience itself. Her former overseer, William Hughes, once recorded a strange line in his ledger. Miss Harwood insists on witnessing all corrections. She says it is not cruelty, but art, the refinement of the will. That one word, art, would later take on terrifying meaning. Eleanor had few true companions. She read philosophy and poetry, corresponded with scholars in Charleston, and was rumored to host private debates with visiting intellectuals. Some found her captivating. Others found her unsettling. Still, her charm was undeniable. When a young tutor named James Sullivan arrived from Boston seeking employment, she welcomed him with the grace of a hostess and the curiosity of a scientist studying a new specimen. She dined with him in her grand hall, discussed Milton and Locke, and by the evening's end had offered him lodging on the estate. No one saw him leave. To the servants, it was as though he'd been swallowed by the house itself. His belongings remained untouched in the guest room, but Eleanor spoke of him in past tense, as though his purpose had already been fulfilled. By October, new faces arrived, a seamstress, an art dealer, a lady's companion, each drawn to the Harwood estate for opportunity, and each quietly absorbed into its silence. But Eleanor was clever. She understood the privilege of her class, the blindness of her society. No one dared question the disappearances connected to a woman of her standing. In a world already built upon human bondage, what was one more person gone missing? And so she continued her masquerade, the charming hostess by day, the architect of something monstrous by night. Later, the journal of Thomas Reading would reveal what no one else dared to imagine: that the east wing of the Harwood mansion was not empty at all. It was occupied by guests who were not free to leave. The marsh outside remained quiet, heavy, eternal. Only the crickets sang. And in that silence, Eleanor Harwood's legend began to grow, the mistress of the marsh, sculpting human souls behind locked doors. The first true window into the nightmare of the Harwood estate didn't open until more than a century after Eleanor's death. In 1963, a renovation crew was clearing the remains of an old gardener's cottage near the overgrown marshes that once surrounded the Harwood property. Beneath a rotted floorboard, sealed inside a rusted tin box, they discovered something unexpected: a small, leather-bound book. Its cover was worn smooth by time, the pages yellowed and brittle, but the handwriting still legible. The signature at the front read, "Thomas Reading, groundskeeper, Harwood Estate, 1834 to 1838. Historians would later call it the most disturbing private journal ever recovered in Georgia's archives. At first, the entries were mundane, notes about the weather, crop yields, the daily routines of the estate. But as the months passed, his words darkened. There were mentions of strange requests, of new locks installed on old doors, and of sounds that came from the east wing long after midnight. One passage, dated September 23, 1837, stood out. Miss Harwood instructed me to prepare the old storage rooms in the east wing. When I asked for what purpose, she smiled and said, "For long-term guests." I was to reinforce the doors, add new locks, and fit smaller windows. Too small for a person to fit through. I don't like this work. I don't like it at all. That entry marked the point where the estate's history split in two, the one society saw, and the one buried beneath its polished veneer. Reading's words were cautious at first, almost deferential. He described Eleanor with the wary respect of a servant bound by duty, but his tone shifted over time. By October, his handwriting grew erratic, his sentences shorter, more desperate. He began referring to the guests, strangers who arrived but never departed. He wrote of a young tutor named Sullivan, a bright and earnest man from Boston, who dined with Miss Harwood and then vanished. A few nights later, Reading heard faint pounding from beneath the floorboards. He convinced himself it was rats, until he heard it again, rhythmic, like fists on wood. "There are sounds no man should hear," one entry read, "and yet I hear them still." In later pages, Reading confessed to seeing things with his own eyes, people dressed in plain white garments, heads shaved, eyes cast down, being led through the east wing hallway. He dared not ask questions. Eleanor forbade it. She called them her collection. She said they are being improved, Reading wrote. Disciplined into something purer, more obedient. I cannot comprehend what she means. Only that there is cruelty in her calm, and joy in their suffering. The journal ended abruptly on January 3, 1838. I can bear this no longer, he wrote. I have recorded everything. Should someone ever read this, know that evil lived here. I go now, lest I too become one of her specimens. After that, silence. No record of reading exists beyond that date. He vanished as completely as those he wrote about. When Emory University archivists examined the journal in the 1960s, they noted something chilling: faint stains on several pages, reddish-brown, soaked through. Perhaps ink. Perhaps not. The journal was sealed soon after, filed under restricted access. But before it disappeared into the archives for good, one historian who read it reportedly said only this: "Some truths aren't meant for the light." The East Wing was never empty. It was alive. By late autumn of 1837, the Harwood estate had changed. The grounds grew quieter, servants walked in pairs, and the once lively air of hospitality had curdled into dread. Even the wind through the marsh seemed to hesitate before touching the mansion's walls. Inside, behind polished doors and heavy velvet drapes, Eleanor Harwood's world was transforming into something entirely her own. Thomas Reading's journal describes the change with growing horror. He writes of being summoned late one night to the East Wing, a part of the house the servants avoided, though none dared say why. The corridor was dim, lined with mirrors, the air thick with the smell of damp stone and something faintly metallic. At the end of the hall, Eleanor waited with a lantern in hand. "Mr. Reading," she said, her voice calm, measured, "you will assist me with my guests. They require discretion." He followed her through a set of reinforced doors that hadn't been opened in years. Behind them were narrow rooms, each identical, each fitted with a small iron bed, a basin, and a single chair. The windows were barred. Reading asked who would be staying there. Eleanor's smile didn't reach her eyes. "They are students of discipline," she said. "People who have lost their way. Here, I offer them refinement." He noticed something else. The walls were padded, not for comfort, but to muffle sound. Within days, the first guests arrived. A young woman claiming to be a seamstress. A traveling art dealer from Charleston. A girl from the city answering an advertisement for a companion. All greeted warmly, all treated as honored visitors, until the doors closed behind them. Reading wrote of hearing voices reciting poetry in the middle of the night, verses from Milton, lines from Greek tragedies. When the words faltered, there followed long stretches of silence, then muffled cries, then nothing. "She tests them," Reading wrote. "Demands perfection in tone and posture, in every syllable they utter. When they fail, she corrects them. I am made to clean the aftermath. I do not know how much longer I can stay." He described Eleanor's fascination with precision, her obsession with ritual. Each morning she entered the East Wing wearing white gloves, carrying a small notebook. She would pace before each locked door, taking notes as though inspecting exhibits in a gallery. She called it the collection. Her captives were stripped of identity. Their hair shorn, their names replaced by numbers, their voices reshaped through forced recitations and endless repetition. They existed only within her system of order, their individuality carved away piece by piece. One night, Reading overheard her speaking to a man's trembling voice behind a locked door. "You should be grateful," she said. "Out there, the world forgets you. In here, I remember every detail. I make you perfect." Her words chilled him more than any scream. It was not rage that fueled her, it was conviction. As the weeks passed, Reading's tone shifted from shock to despair. He no longer questioned what was happening, he only wondered when it would end. He began referring to the East Wing as the House of Silence. In one final note from November 1837, he wrote, "I have served in this place for years, and yet I do not know my mistress at all. There is something in her beyond cruelty, a belief that she is creating beauty through suffering. God forgive me, for I still obey her commands." The East Wing was locked again that night. From the outside, the Harwood estate looked unchanged, its windows aglow with candlelight, its gardens immaculate. But inside, behind those sealed doors, the refinement of Eleanor Harwood's guests had only just begun. What compels a person to believe they have the right to reshape another human being? For Eleanor Harwood, the answer lay somewhere between obsession and faith. She saw herself not as a monster, but as an artist, one who sculpted flesh and will instead of marble and clay. Thomas Reading's journal captures the beginnings of this ideology in fragments of overheard speech and moments that defied reason. He describes Eleanor spending hours in her study, poring over philosophical texts and annotating passages about control, order, and the hierarchy of the soul. Plato, Locke, Augustine. But she twisted their meaning, bending them into a private doctrine of absolute mastery. Discipline is not cruelty, she once told Reading, it is clarity. People crave it, even if they don't understand why. The world outside is chaos. In here, I bring order. Her captives became her disciples, though unwilling ones. Each was assigned lessons, poetry to memorize, music to perform, histories to recite. The slightest imperfection, a missed note, a trembling word, was met with what she called correction. Reading never described these punishments in detail, but his writing trembles around them. The sounds, he wrote, are not human, and yet they come from human throats. To Eleanor, pain was not punishment, it was purification. They thank me in their silence, she told her groundskeeper once, her tone as calm as if discussing the weather. I stripped them of the burden of choice. In this perverse logic, she saw herself as savior and sculptor both. She wasn't killing her guests, she was refining them. It's easy to dismiss such ideas as madness, but in the decaying morality of the antebellum South, her worldview found fertile ground. Society already sanctioned the ownership of human beings. Eleanor simply extended that logic to its most intimate extreme. Where others saw servants, she saw subjects. Where others demanded obedience, she demanded transformation. Reading recalled a chilling moment in which she spoke to one of her captives, the art dealer from Charleston. You misunderstand freedom, she told him. It's an illusion, like sunlight on water. Here, I will make you something real. Her belief had become almost religious. She prayed before her lessons, whispering words he couldn't quite hear. The journal notes strange symbols carved into the wood of the East Wing hallway, circular marks that seemed more ritual than decoration. Eleanor began to isolate herself further. Her social gatherings ceased. The plantation workers saw less of her. The house itself seemed to bend to her new order. Candles burned later. Meals were served in silence. Doors that once opened freely now stayed locked. To the outside world, the Harwood estate remained prosperous. To those within it, it had become a kind of monastery, but one devoted to a god of her own making. Reading's entries from December 1837 show the toll her madness took on him. He questioned his own sanity, whether he was complicit simply by obeying. She speaks of perfection as if it were salvation, he wrote. But what she calls perfection smells of blood. Perhaps the most chilling passage comes near the end of that month. Tonight, she showed me one of them. His eyes were empty, but he smiled when she entered the room. She said, "See, he is complete." I do not know if he was alive or something less. By then, Eleanor Harwood had crossed a threshold from cruelty into creation. In her mind, she was not tormenting people, she was shaping them. And like all creators intoxicated by their power, she would soon destroy what she could not perfect. In the years that followed the winter of 1837, the Harwood estate began to fade from Savannah's social memory. Parties ceased. The carriages that once rolled up its oak-lined drive grew fewer, then none at all. By 1842, the once splendid mansion had become a hushed landmark of unease, a relic people passed on their way to the coast but never approached. That February, a bitter storm blew through the marshes. Wind lashed at the live oaks, and lightning stalked the horizon. According to surviving newspaper accounts, the blaze began shortly after midnight. The east wing went up first. Neighbors claimed to see an orange glow blooming behind the fog, followed by the low, rolling thunder of collapsing timber. By the time help arrived from Savannah, the mansion was already half consumed. Fire raced along the old heart pine floors, devouring the very part of the house where Eleanor's secret world had thrived. When rescuers reached her, they found her standing in the courtyard barefoot, her nightgown streaked with soot. She watched the east wing burn without moving, without weeping, her face lit by the inferno like a marble statue. "They were imperfect," she said to one of the men who found her. "The fire cleanses what cannot be perfected." 3 bodies were pulled from the ruins the following morning, unidentified, listed in county records only as household members. No funerals were held. The remains were buried together in an unmarked grave behind the estate. Eleanor herself survived with little more than smoke in her lungs. Within a week, she sold what remained of the property to a distant cousin and vanished from Savannah entirely. She reappeared briefly in Charleston a year later, living quietly in a narrow townhouse on Trad Street. The fire, the papers said, was likely caused by faulty wiring from recent renovations. But the Harwood mansion had never been fitted with such wiring. It was still lit by oil lamps and candlelight. Others whispered that she had said it herself, that the East Wing's secrets had finally consumed her, or that something in those locked rooms, something not entirely human, had burned its way out. In the years that followed, people avoided that stretch of marshland. Hunters claimed their dogs refused to cross the old property line. Travelers spoke of strange stillness, no birds, no frogs, no wind among the reeds. The land seemed to have gone deaf. When archaeologists examined the site over a century later, they found only scorched brick and iron, door hinges fused by heat, rusted locks melted into the remains of doorframes. In one corner, they discovered a section of blackened floor tile beneath which lay several pairs of small iron restraints anchored to the foundation. The records from 1842 list the official cause of death for the 3 unidentified victims as accidental immolation. No further investigation was ever conducted. Eleanor lived quietly for 17 more years. She never rebuilt, never spoke publicly of the fire. To her new neighbors in Charleston, she was merely a reclusive widow who played the piano at odd hours. To the people of Savannah, she became a rumor, a cautionary ghost of the marsh. But even fire, it seems, could not erase her legacy. The East Wing had been reduced to ash, but the memory of what it once held, the experiments, the screams, the obsession with perfection, remained embedded in the soil. Some said that when the wind turned inland, the smell of smoke still drifted through the reeds. Others swore they could hear faint music rising from the marsh, as though the house itself was still trying to play the last piece Eleanor never finished. By December of 1837, winter had come early to the Georgia coast. A brittle cold hung over the marshes, and mist curled like breath around the cypress trees. Inside the Harwood mansion, the fires burned longer, but warmth had long since abandoned the place. Thomas Reading's journal grows unsteady here. His pen strokes shake, his sentences fracture. The calm observer who once wrote of weather and wages now sounds like a man haunted. "The silence in this house," he wrote, "is alive. It presses against the walls. It listens." Eleanor Harwood had withdrawn completely from the social world. Servants whispered that she slept in the East Wing now, among her captives. Reading saw less of her by daylight, more by lamplight, her silhouette moving behind curtains at impossible hours. The journal's entries from mid-December describe a night unlike any other. Eleanor summoned Reading to the East Wing after midnight. Her hair was unbound, her dress torn, and her hands stained with something dark. She was trembling, Reading wrote. Not from fear, but from fury. She said one of them had failed beyond repair. Defective, she called her. In the farthest room, on the cold floor, lay the seamstress, the young woman who had come seeking work only months before. Her body was still, her white garment soaked through. Eleanor ordered Reading to help her move it. "I asked if she lived," he wrote. She struck my hand away and said, "It's not your concern if the material is flawed." Together, they carried the body out through the servants' passage and into the marsh. The ground was frozen shallowly, hard enough that the spade rang when it hit. They buried her beneath the reeds, and Eleanor marked the spot with nothing but a broken branch. "The North Marsh," Reading noted. She said the ground does not remember there. But he was wrong. The land always remembers. After that night, something shifted in the house. The other captives grew restless. Reading wrote of low sounds, half-words, prayers echoing from behind the locked doors. Eleanor's corrections became more frequent, her patience shorter. She began speaking to her captives as if they were mirrors of herself. She calls them reflections, he wrote. Says they show her what she must destroy in herself to become perfect. By Christmas week, the plantation's operations had nearly ceased. Workers received no instructions. Supplies went unordered. The estate existed only for Eleanor's experiment. Reading begged her to release him from service. She refused. "You've seen too much," she said, her voice cold as the frost on the windows. In the final days of the year, Reading's writing becomes desperate, almost delirious. He speaks of hearing footsteps behind him even when he is alone. Of seeing shadows in mirrors where no one stands. Of Eleanor humming a lullaby through the East Wing halls, a melody that made his skin crawl. Then, his final entry. "I can bear this no longer. I have written everything. Should someone find this, know that I was complicit. My silence made her strong. May God forgive me for dwelling in the house of the devil." After January 3, 1838, there were no more words. No record of Reading's departure. No sign of his body. No trace of his soul. The Harwood estate remained quiet for years afterward, as if holding its breath. Neighbors would later say they sometimes heard faint piano music drifting from the direction of the marsh, soft, precise, and unbearably sad. And though no one ever saw Eleanor at the keys, they all agreed on one thing. She played flawlessly. The ruins of the Harwood estate smoldered into history, and for more than a century, the story might have ended there. Half-remembered whispers about a fire, a mysterious woman, and a house that the marsh itself refused to reclaim. But history has a strange way of breathing again when someone digs too deep. In the spring of 1963, renovation crews clearing the grounds of what was once the Harwood property stumbled upon a buried wooden chest. Inside was the journal of Thomas Reading, the same one whose words would reawaken a century of silence. It was not just a diary, it was a confession sealed in rot and dust. The ink had bled, but the dread within every sentence was unmistakable. When Emory University archivists examined the book, they realized it aligned disturbingly well with local folklore, stories of the mistress who collected souls. They catalogued the artifact, sealed it under restricted access, and quietly ended the investigation. But not before a handful of historians and graduate students read enough to understand that the fire in 1842 had not destroyed everything. One of them, Margaret Collins, was a doctoral student researching antebellum crime. She spent weeks poring over the fragile pages, taking careful notes. Then, abruptly, she withdrew from the university, returned to her hometown, and refused to speak of her research again. When contacted years later, she said only, "Some histories should stay buried. Some minds should not be understood." After her departure, the journal was reported misplaced. It vanished from Emory's archives, a disappearance as complete as any Eleanor herself had orchestrated. Around the same time, more evidence surfaced. In 1966, during the renovation of a Savannah law office once connected to Judge William Crawford, workers found a bundle of old letters. In one, Crawford described an unsettling encounter with Eleanor Harwood at a dinner years before the fire. "She spoke at length of human refinement," he wrote. "Said some people were born to be guided, others to guide. I mentioned the rumors of her house guests who never depart. She smiled and said, 'My hospitality is simply too compelling for some to resist.'" The letter ended with a line that chilled even the most hardened historians. There was something in her eyes, as if she carried a light that burned those who looked too long. Then came the discovery that finally confirmed the journal's truth. In 1967, a University of Georgia archaeological team conducted a survey of the former Harwood estate site. They found remnants of the house's foundation, blackened stones, twisted metal, and beneath them, a small burial plot in the North Marsh, exactly where Reading had said they buried the seamstress. 4 skeletons lay there. One, a young woman in her 20s, wore a thimble clasped in her skeletal hand. Others bore signs of healed fractures and malnutrition. The State Historical Society took custody of the remains, but no report was ever published. The bones were quietly reburied, the investigation closed. Later inquiries into why the findings were suppressed led to a simple but haunting answer. Too many powerful families in Georgia traced lineage to the Harwoods. The past, it seemed, had benefactors. But the soil itself had already spoken. Beneath the marsh, beneath the ash and the memory of flame, lay undeniable proof of the horrors that had once been dismissed as legend. Eleanor Harwood had existed. Her captives had existed. And though the official record tried to silence them, the ground remembered their names in the only way it could, through bones, through blood, through silence that refuses to fade. Even now, those who walk the edges of the marsh at dusk say the earth feels uneven, as if something beneath still shifts, restless, unburied in spirit if not in form. And when the wind turns cold and low across that dark water, they say it almost sounds like pages turning. There are places in this world where the air itself seems to hold a memory, where the land feels heavier, older, as though burdened by what it has witnessed. The marshlands south of Savannah is one of those places. Even now, locals call it the Quiet Bend. Not because it's peaceful, but because it's too silent. Birds skirt the area. Frogs fall mute. The reeds sway but make no sound. It's as if the land itself has sworn an oath of silence. In the years following the rediscovery of Thomas Reading's journal, reporters and paranormal researchers alike visited the site. Most left with nothing more than mosquito bites and muddy boots. But a few claimed to feel something stranger, a presence that wasn't quite malevolent, but wasn't benign either. One journalist from the Savannah Chronicle wrote, "Standing on that marsh soil, I felt like I was trespassing on someone else's memory. The air was thick, the kind that makes you whisper without knowing why." For generations, the locals have had their own explanations. Some say the soil is sour, that crops won't take, foundations sink, and machines fail without reason. Builders who tried to develop the area in the 1970s abandoned their plans after one too many collapses. They blamed engineering issues. The old families blamed something older. An elderly Gullah Geechee man interviewed in 1966 put it plainly. That place remembers. You can burn the house, you can hide the bones, but the land don't forget the pain that soaked into it. His words echoed what Reading himself had written more than a century before, that the marsh would one day speak for those who could not. Visitors still claim strange sensations, the feeling of being watched, the faint sound of piano keys beneath the hum of the wind. Hunters swear their dogs refuse to enter the boundary where the east wing once stood. Photographs taken near sunset often reveal streaks of light shaped like human outlines. Skeptics call it pareidolia, the mind seeing faces where none exist. But locals prefer another term, witnesses. Over time, the story of Eleanor Harwood twisted from history into folklore. Parents warned their children that the marsh belonged to the mistress, a restless spirit searching for perfection in those who dared to wander too close. The legend grew with every telling. Some said she still appeared in the fog, others that she whispered from the water's edge, asking if you would stay as her guest. But perhaps the most unsettling part isn't the superstition, it's the silence of official history. Despite all the evidence, the journal, the letters, the graves, Eleanor's name remains absent from Georgia's public records of crime. It's as if the state itself refused to acknowledge her sins. That silence speaks louder than any ghost story. Because the real haunting of the Harwood estate isn't spectral, it's moral. It's what happens when an entire society chooses not to see, not to speak, not to remember. Eleanor's collection was an echo of a greater cruelty, one that defined her time, the ownership of human lives. She simply extended that power where no law reached, behind the locked doors of her estate, in the private theater of her own madness. And perhaps that's why the marsh remains unsettled. Because the land remembers what the records deny. So when the wind drifts low across that quiet bend, and the sound dips into something almost human, a sigh, a hum, a faint note of music, maybe it isn't a haunting after all. Maybe it's the land itself refusing to let the story die. The land remembers. Even when people try to forget. Time has a way of dulling even the sharpest horrors, sanding them down until they seem almost unreal. Yet some stories resist erosion. They cling to the edges of history like a scar that refuses to fade. The tale of Eleanor Harwood is one of them, a story buried, burned, and buried again, but never quite gone. In the years since Thomas Reading's journal resurfaced, historians, psychologists, and artists have all tried to make sense of her. Was she a symptom of her time or a monster unique to herself? A product of the cruelty that surrounded her, or its logical conclusion? The truth lies somewhere in between. Eleanor's collection was an extension of the world that shaped her. In a society that permitted the ownership of human beings, she simply shifted the lens inward, claiming not only bodies but minds, wills, and identities. She turned control into a kind of art, cruelty into ritual. And in doing so, she exposed something horrifyingly human, the desire to dominate, to shape others in our own image. Over the decades, her name has become a whisper in academic circles. Occasionally, a graduate student will stumble across a reference to the Harwood collection in an obscure journal or an uncatalogued archive. Each time, access mysteriously closes, citations vanish, files are misplaced. It's as if the story itself resists illumination, slipping back into the shadows whenever someone looks too closely. And yet, pieces keep surfacing. A letter here. A photograph there. The faint echo of piano notes carried on the wind. In 1973, a local historian interviewed an elderly woman named Clara Mitchell, whose grandmother had worked as a laundress for a neighboring estate. She remembered hearing about Miss Eleanor's rooms, the ones even the house slaves wouldn't go near. They said the guests who entered those rooms weren't slaves but weren't free neither. Mitchell's grandmother would shudder when she spoke of it and murmur, "Some people got a hunger no food can fill." That hunger, that relentless need for power, control, and creation, is what defines Eleanor's legacy. It's easy to paint her as an aberration, a lone villain in a dark chapter of history. But perhaps that's too convenient. Because her story forces us to confront a deeper, more uncomfortable truth. The systems that allowed her to exist have never truly vanished. They've merely changed form. Control now comes dressed in civility, in influence, in subtle coercion. The same impulse that drove Eleanor to perfect her captives still lingers wherever one person believes their will should overwrite another's. Her story is not just about the past, it's a mirror held to the present. Standing on that stretch of Georgia marsh today, there is nothing left of the Harwood mansion. No marker, no plaque, no memorial. Just wind and grass and the hush of water beneath the reeds. Yet for those who know what happened there, the silence is almost deafening. Because silence, too, can be a kind of remembrance. Maybe the truest justice for the victims, the ones stripped of names and faces, is not in punishment but in memory. To say, aloud, that they lived, that they mattered, that even if their bones lie nameless in the marsh, their suffering carved a warning deep into the soil. Power without conscience is the oldest horror of all. As the sun sinks over Savannah's horizon, the air turns thick with the scent of salt and silt. The reeds sway. Somewhere, faintly, a piano note rises, carried by the wind, unfinished, unresolved. And if you listen closely, it almost sounds like a voice whispering from the earth itself. We were here.